Um, I have to apologise in advance because I know that what I'm about to share has been widely published and some of you might have heard it before. So if you have heard it before, I hope that this time you can get a different kind of message out of it. But to highlight the importance of language, I wanted to share with you a letter I wrote to my own social worker. So a couple of years ago, I um, I accessed my own files from care, and like many people here, that was a very painful and difficult experience. And I was really frustrated to be written about, but never consulted in my notes. So my response really was to have my own say and to reach out to the social worker and to say what impact that those case notes had on me as an individual. So I'm going to share the letter that I wrote, and while I share it, there's going to be extracts that flash up on the screen. Um, you're all adults, you don't need me to tell you, but some of the case notes are quite sensitive or might be triggering. So if you need to take time out at any point, that's absolutely fine. And then, thank goodness, we'll go beyond my messages and focus on some of the other messages about language that come up in the book. But without further ado, it goes like this. Dear Tara, before I wrote this letter, I double-checked the spelling of your name just to make sure it was correct. I know how jarring it can be when the basics are not quite right. You misspelt my name almost 100 times in the case files you wrote about me while I was under your care. I received these last week after submitting an SAR request to the relevant local authority. Speaking of names, let me remind you of mine. My name is Rebekah. It is the Hebrew spelling, and I'm quite fond of it. It may sound like a small detail to some, but to me it matters. It is the name I was given when I was born. I once corrected the spelling, as you can see in case note 1, but it was never changed on the system. Instead, a rather blunt note was added to say, this is the spelling of her name according to her. For the record, I wasn't lying. This was just one of many examples where I wasn't believed. I don't know if my name rings a bell, but even if it does, you probably wouldn't recognise me now. You were involved in my life at a time when I was extremely vulnerable and on the verge of being homeless. A 16-year-old girl with everything to live for who didn't have much interest in living at all. Since that time, much has changed. Despite being a young person who's a little mixed up about the direction of her life, see case note 2, I ended up following in your footsteps. I wanted to be like the residential social worker I had after you, who practiced with care, kindness, and compassion. I have since had the privilege of working alongside many such social workers who transform lives every day. On reflection, perhaps I wasn't so mixed up about the direction of my life after all. During my career, I have read case notes of varying quality. Most have been child-centred and thorough, others have not. But for all I have read, nothing could have prepared me for reading my own records, particularly the entries written by you. To give you the benefit of the doubt, I imagine you've changed since writing them. Your approach may well be unrecognisable now. It is why I took the time to write this letter. I have some small faith that this time you will hear me. I hope in earnest that you will. I cannot pretend my recording is perfect. I know how hard it is to write good case notes whilst balancing competing deadlines and crises, but I have always done my utmost to be respectful, to write with the child in mind. In your defence, I don't think I was the audience you had in mind when you wrote them, was I? Perhaps you saw the screen in front of you as the final destination. It was not. Your words, written about but without me, would not remain hidden forever. One day I would understand my rights. Speaking of rights, do you remember taking me to an Achieving Best Evidence interview after school, where I had to disclose the most traumatic events of my life to yourself and a police officer? It was my right to have an advocate, something I only learned years later. It took all the strength I had to get through those 4 hours, with no emotional support or break. I have never felt so small, so humiliated. Looking back, it was like an inquisition, like somehow I was the one on trial. Now it is my turn to ask the questions. The first is this: how dare you? It took more courage than you will ever know to disclose that a child known to my extended family, who became an adult while I was still a minor, abused me in childhood. If you believe that I was experimenting or in a relationship with the perpetrator, as you suggest in case note 3, then your thinking isn't only flawed but dangerous. I was a child. I could not consent. I refer you to the independent inquiry into CSC in Rotherham, something you would have known about, given it was then ongoing. Its messages are clear. Do not blame victims, show empathy, and believe them. Which begs the question, where did you draw the conclusions that the allegations were complex with consent issues? What observable evidence did you base this on? Were you there when the perpetrator threatened me into silence, forbidding me to tell anyone? Were you there when I used to crawl under the bed to hide from them? Did you hear as I made my breathing imperceptible so I wouldn't be found, when I played dead to survive? Were you there in the room when it happened? Did you watch as my soul left my body, a pattern of dissociation which continued long after it stopped? Were you there when my OCD spiraled out of control? When I couldn't pay attention at school because, in my helplessness, I used to repeat the same words incessantly for hours on end? Please, God, make this stop. Were you there? This was not the only time I wasn't believed. When disclosing domestic abuse, the marks still fresh on my body, you minimise this too. Is an attack on a child at the hands of an adult ever an altercation, as you describe in case note 4, or is it abuse? On a similar note, why, after I presented at A&E dangerously unwell, was no further action recommended, with no explanation? Do you know how it feels to read that such a traumatic event was met with a tick box? No further action seems to be the common response, as seen in case note 6. After I called you 200 miles away from my unregulated placement, you advised I could return home alone due to my age and independence. No follow-up was ever given to see if I was okay. My records, just like your involvement with me, end rather abruptly. The very last sentence, Rebekah would like to speak to her social worker, stands unanswered across the passage of time. I never did hear from you again. It is too late to go back in time, but it is not too late to make a meaningful change for other children. May your words be worthy of each of them. Who knows, one day you may find yourself reading what they grow up to write about you. Yours, Rebekah, with a K. It's always a little bit strange sharing that letter because it is so very personal and because I'm not in the room to kind of do a litmus test on how everybody feels after hearing something that's quite heavy. But the reason I share it is because it's an example that as care experience people were often written about in case notes and assessments and files, and so little thought is given to us. And actually I think that people like my social worker seriously underestimate what we as care experience people are capable of, and our voice, and that we have the ability to, share our own narratives and perspectives. And so that's the reason I share it. But I want to stress that that is one letter out of about 15 letters in the book. So the book has a whole chapter dedicated to open letters because I realised that we're always at the receiving end of letters, and we're very rarely the authors of them. So please do, don't just read or listen to my letter. Do take the time to read many of the other letters in there as well. Okay, so I've got 4 minutes left, I think. Very quickly, moving on to how the book was put together and why the messages and the voices matter. Firstly, we had a no rejection policy, which in the world of publishing is practically unheard of. So anyone who'll remember the Care Review, which came out about a year before the book, will know that about 1,000 people applied to be on their expert by experience board, including myself, and over 900 of us were rejected via email. And so there's this culture of seeking input from care experience people, but then there being a very narrow pool and limited space. So it was really important that the book was no rejection. There was no writing experience necessary, which was really important for a group who often are, denied denied access to education and so on. And everything about the book, from the editing to the front cover to the sensitivity read, it was all done by care experienced people. I've not got a lot of time, so I would like to just spend the limited time I do have sharing the words of some of our other contributors. I wanted to, the letter I shared is kind of heavy, but I wanted to end on a positive, and this I think is one of the most positive extracts of the book, and it's so beautifully shared. So I'm gonna be really annoying and read it out, even though I'd much prefer it to be Chantel who was reading it out. But she says, before I was adopted at the age of 9, I put a handwritten prayer into the prayer box at school, asking God to find me a forever family who would love me unconditionally. Every night after posting it, I stayed up late praying for the same fortune. In my heart, I believed it would come true. 2 weeks later, after years of failed prayers for my birth parents to get better and take me back, Gail, my social worker at the time, one of many, a kind woman with a caring, patient, and motherly spirit, informed me that my prayer had been answered. Gail was a shining light during my time in care, a rarity, someone with whom I always felt safe. Anyone who's aware of the book or who was at the book launch will know that Chantel, through the launch, Chantel and Gail, her social worker, were reunited after about 20 years, which is just so wonderful. And so Free Loaves on Fridays, it doesn't just speak to the trauma and the mess and the pain, it also speaks to the really positive impact that good intervention can have, and about all the Gails out there in the world who are unspoken, unsung heroes, and the brilliant things that they do. I was really wanting to play this video, but we don't have time, so I'm going to instead pop the link in the chat so that you can listen to one of our excellent contributors, Sam Upton, who shares a poem that she wrote, and it's the very first, but hopefully not last poem she'd ever published, and it's called What If We Were Told New Stories. So I'll pop that in the chat for you. Proceeds of the book go to Article 39 and the Together Trust. So do get your copy, do listen to, I think we've shared maybe 3 or 4 contributors' words, but all 100 deserve to be heard. So I'm going to leave it there.